YouTube. I hope you guys are doing well despite everything happening with the coronavirus. For my part, here in Belgium, we're still in a lockdown situation, and we will probably be for quite some time. I know that I promised in a previous video that I would give you some more videos on how I shoot this situation, how I document it. It took me a bit longer than expected because I underestimated the amount of work, time and energy it would take to get the kids up and running for school, to get our own stuff sorted out. But here I am, and in this video I'm going to tell you what cameras I use, what lenses I use, and what settings I use to document these COVID-19 days. There are two cameras that I lean to document life, and life's different now, but it's still life, so I figure I probably use the same setups that I would use normally to document my life. Now, the first camera is the X100V. The other camera is the Fujifilm X-Pro3 with the 35mm f1.4. Now, let's first take a look at the X100V and why I take this camera and when I take this camera. First of all, it's smaller. It's quite a bit smaller than an X-Pro3, so it's easier to take with me if I have to go out and go to the store, or if I go for a walk or a bike ride, which luckily is still possible. But the smaller compact camera is definitely easier to take with me. So from a pure practical point of view, this is the one that goes out of the house the most. It also has a slightly wider angle lens, so there's a 23mm, which is like a 35 on full frame camera. While on my X-Pro3 I'm using the 35, which is equivalent to a 50mm lens. So this is quite a bit wider actually than the 35. So when I'm shooting a situation where I want to have the whole scene in the picture, or where I want to give some more context, the X100 with a 23mm is my better tool, or is a better option. So I think in general the X100V is a bit more snapshot ready, so it's just grab and push the button and you have a picture, while with the X-Pro3 it's a bit more about the more deliberate shots, the more thought out pictures. It requires a bit more concentration to shoot with the X-Pro3 as opposed to the X100V, and of course it is pretty much silent when you take a picture. So if I'm taking pictures around the house, of the kids, of my girlfriend, it usually takes a while and a couple of pictures by the time they notice that I'm actually taking pictures. But if I had to pick just one of these two cameras, I would probably go for the X-Pro3. I've always been a bit of a 35mm or 50mm equivalent person. It just suits me better. It's more natural to me. I also like the fact that this camera forces me to focus on what I'm shooting. It's just, I've always been slightly in favor of the X-Pro bodies as opposed to any other camera. But that 35mm 50 equivalent lens also allows me to pick my shots a bit better, pick my subjects a bit better. And like in our house, there's kids running around, there's toys lying around, there's schoolwork lying around, there's laundry, there's just like in probably every other household with kids. So it can be a bit messy. It's not really messy, but it can look messy in pictures if you have a wider lens and a bigger depth of field. The 1.4 allows me to have a smaller depth of field, and the slightly longer lens allows me to pick my shots a bit better, which is probably the reason why I naturally gravitate towards this combination. And then there's that little magic of the 35mm 1.4. I noticed that magic 7 or 8 years ago when I actually bought this lens, and it's still there even on the newer bodies. There's just something about it. It has nothing to do with technical specifications. It's just a look that I seem to like a little bit more than any other lens. And I've explained this before, the X-Pro3 is very much an in-the-moment camera. It forces you to be in the moment, to be present while you take the pictures. I know it's very subjective, but the X-Pro3 has a slight edge over the X100V if I had to choose between the two. I have both, so and they're both, I could do the job with either of them. I could do the job with with an older camera, I could do the job with a DSLR, I could do the job with my phone. So don't focus too much on the gear. You don't have to order a new camera to document these days. Another thing that I would like to say is that don't give yourself too many options. If you have all your lenses, all your camera bodies at the ready, then you will need to pick one each time you want to take a picture. And I find it much easier to just pick the camera that is closest and just start shooting with whatever you have. I can see pretty easily in 23 or 35, so even before I pick the camera up, I have the shot in mind. I know where to stand to take the picture. So keep it simple, use the same gear over and over, and don't give yourself too many options because they will get in your way of documenting your life. The most important thing is to keep your cameras at the ready at all times. You never know when a picture will occur. You won't be running around with a camera around your neck all day because there's other things to do. Some of us work from home. We have to take care of the kids. We have to do the general household things. Some might be doing a spring clean, whatever. So you won't be in photographer mode at all times, but make sure that your camera is at the ready at all times. And as you can see, with whatever camera I'm using, I'm not using any lens caps. The camera is ready at the same time. I'm using lens hoods to protect the lens, and every now and then I wipe off the front element because there's a bit of dust on it. The camera has a full battery in it. The memory cards, there's plenty of space on the memory card, so I can just pick it up, switch it on and take a picture. And I think that's a very important thing to do. Also, don't leave the camera in a bag or in a closet. Keep it on your desk, on the kitchen table, on the coffee table, whatever, but make sure that you can just grab it and shoot it. After I take a picture and put my camera away, I also take some time to reset my camera settings to a neutral setting. So I return all my settings to normal. Then in a normal situation, I can just push the button and have the picture without changing any settings. Now let me run you through my standard settings on the camera, and mind you, you might have different preferences. It's just the way that I do it. Feel free to try it out. Feel free to reject if it's not your thing. But this is the way that I usually set my cameras up for these kind of situations. Now, first of all, if you use multiple cameras, make sure that the clocks and the dates are set exactly at the same date, because otherwise it's going to be a nightmare to organize your pictures later on. Check them every now and then because these clocks tend to drift quite a bit over time. You know that I'm a Fujifilm user, you know that I am one of their official ex-photographers, so I'm using Fuji cameras, but most of the things that I'm going to explain can be set on pretty much any other camera. So generally I like to have my cameras perform most of the exposure duties. I used to shoot everything in manual, but with the advance of technology these days, the automatic exposure has gotten so good. It's gotten faster than I am. I shoot in aperture priority. This allows me to decide the look of the pictures, at least when it comes to the depth of field. And generally I start a little bit more close down than wide open. On the 35-1.4 here, I'm generally setting my camera at f2, and I might change it according to the situation, but that's my base point, that's my starting point, is usually f2. On the X100V, I'm usually at 2.8 as a starting point, unless it's like at nighttime, there's not much light, then I often set it already to f2. But then I know it's the only thing that I have to keep in mind. So my aperture is set on this camera at f2, and all the rest is automatic. So my shutter speed is at automatic, and also my ISO settings are at automatic. The only way to change the exposure is by using the exposure compensation. Now when it comes to auto ISO, which means that the camera will automatically adjust the ISO according to the light levels, I generally make the range as wide as possible. So on my Fujifilm cameras, that's with a minimum ISO of 160 and a maximum ISO of 12,800. And I set the minimum shutter speed to 160 because I figured that if you go any lower than 160, I experience quite a lot of shots where there's motion blur in the picture. So that's usually where I'm at. I might change things up depending on the situation. I don't mind going high in the ISOs, definitely not for this documentary style pictures. I generally shoot raw files, but I still try to set my JPEG settings, film simulations in a way that I think that looks nice to me, or is at least rather neutral, so I know what kind of detail I have to work with later on. I'll be showing you some of my JPEG settings. I'm gonna give you a black and white and a color one that I use mostly in these kind of situations. I change things up a lot, but these are probably again a good base point. So here are my JPEG settings, two setups that I use quite a lot. The AF mode, I set it to just that one point, single point AF, because I think it's the easiest way to work most of the time, but I may change it whenever I need to. Dynamic range, I always keep this at 100, because otherwise if it's on automatic, it means that you can start the camera goes in higher ISO values without you maybe not wanting it, so I keep it on 100 at all times. White balance, automatic. Sometimes I set a preset white balance, but usually it's on automatic. When I'm shooting JPEG, I often set a preset because it's one of the things that you cannot change without losing quality if you're shooting a JPEG. But when I'm shooting RAW, I usually go in this direction. Noise reduction, I always put on -4, the lowest that you can get. I prefer a grainy image over a waxy skin tone image, and I think that the noise reduction on the Fujifilm cameras is a bit aggressive and gets away detail. If you really have to, you can remove some noise later on in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever you are using, but I always put it on -4 no matter what settings that I'm using. I shoot in RAW pretty much all the time, although I use JPEG on some occasions. On my X-Pro3 I'm shooting RAW plus JPEG, have the RAWs on one card and the JPEGs on the other card. I would do it with the X100V too, but that means that I will get a JPEG and a RAW file on the same card. And since I'm editing most of this on Lightroom Mobile, it can be a bit cumbersome to separate these two files. Film simulation, the classic NEG, the new one, is pretty nice. I feel that it can look really amazing, but depending on the situation, sometimes it's also not so good looking. I find it works great if you have plenty of light and if you have slightly high key pictures. On the darker pictures, the skin tones can look a bit funky at times, but there's plenty of choice of other film simulations. With All the rest of the settings I probably keep most of the time the same, but I might switch the film simulation to, let's say, the classic chrome, or even STS sometimes, or the negative one. It looks good with any of these film simulations. Highlight tone, I usually set that to -1 to protect the highlights a bit. It only is in a JPEG mode, but I just set it up always like this, whether I'm shooting raw or JPEG. Shadow tone at +1 makes the shadows a bit deeper, gives the image a bit more contrast, and like I said, I shoot raw, so most of these settings don't really matter too much, but it gives me a good idea of what my image will look like once I processed it. Color is at 0, sharpness is at 0. And maybe the last thing that I would like to say is that I often have face eye detection setting to automatic eye detection, and I have the face eye detection setting, I have that mapped to the front of the camera, to this button, so I can easily switch that on or off. But basically that's about the settings that I use for color. If we go to black and white, you'll see that I use pretty much the same settings, but instead of classic negative, I'm using the across or across with the yellow filter. But otherwise my settings pretty much stay the same. There's other settings that I use sometimes, definitely when I'm shooting JPEG, but most of the time when I'm shooting RAW, I'm just changing the film simulation and I leave the other settings the same. Other settings that you may want to know about, let's quickly run through the menu on my X100V, and let me point out some of the things that I changed, that I set, and why. Most of the time I shoot RAW, and I use the compressed file size. Makes it easier to put put a lot of files on the card. It also takes up less space and less upload if I'm using Lightroom Mobile. The one thing you have to know is that you cannot get previews with compressed RAWs in Lightroom Mobile, while you can if you use the full ones. I've talked about my film simulation and other settings before, so I'm not going over that. Grain effect, color chrome effect, and color FX blue effect, I keep them off. They're interesting to play with, but they don't have much influence on a RAW file anyway. Now, one thing about the clarity thing, if you put it on, it's great, it gives your images a bit more pop, but it takes a lot more to process an image, and then you'll see that your camera slows down immediately. I see a lot of people on forums and Facebook groups saying that, hey, my camera is taking a long time to write a file. Well, check the clarity settings, you probably have that turned on. Long exposure, noise reduction, of color space, I still use Adobe RGB, it's the widest, so it should be the best. Focus points, I use all the focus points. I put the AF eliminator off. I'm not a big fan of touchscreens, so I just turn them off. But if you want to use it, go ahead, you have the choice. Corrected AF frame, that's for the hybrid viewfinder, at least for the optical viewfinder. Always turn that on if you have an X100 or an X-Pro camera. So this is the auto ISO setting. Like I said, it is default at 160, maximum sensitivity 12,800, and the minimum shutter speed at 1/160. You can have your separate video settings these days with the newer Fujifilm cameras. I'm not really using it on this camera, on this project, so I'm not going to go over that. I keep the AF beeps off on all my cameras. I think they're just unnecessary and they attract attention. You can see that also the operation volume is turned off, shutter volume is turned off, so I don't make any more noise than I have to. Another thing that I always turn off is shoot without card. turn that off, because otherwise you might be taking pictures and there's no card in the camera, so you don't have the pictures. So these are my camera's lenses and settings that I use to mainly document these Corona times. I hope you got something out of it, but again, this is how I do it. You might have a completely different point of view. You might use different settings. That's all fine, but I always find it interesting to see how other people set up their camera and maybe pick up one or two tricks that I can use in my way of shooting. So that was it for this video. Stay safe, people. Don't go around doing stupid things like many people are still doing, unfortunately. Stay safe. Try and document whatever you can. It is important. And I will be back very shortly with a new video that is not so much going to be about the technical aspects of how I shoot, but some more non-technical things about documenting life in these weird times. See you soon. Stay safe. Bye.